In April 2004, a set of photographs from a prison outside Baghdad changed how millions of people saw the Iraq War. The images, first broadcast by CBS News and then published more widely, showed detainees at Abu Ghraib prison being humiliated, threatened, and abused by members of the United States military. For many viewers, the scandal was shocking not only because of the cruelty shown, but because it involved a country that publicly claimed to be bringing democracy, rule of law, and human rights to Iraq. Abu Ghraib quickly became more than the name of a prison. It became a symbol of how war, fear, secrecy, and weak accountability can create conditions where detainees are stripped of basic human dignity. Abu Ghraib already had a dark history before U.S. forces used it during the Iraq War. Under Saddam Hussein, the prison was infamous as a site of political imprisonment, torture, and executions. After the 2003 invasion, the U.S. military took control of the facility and used it to hold thousands of detainees. Some were suspected insurgents, some were common criminals, and many were civilians swept up during raids or security operations. The International Committee of the Red Cross later reported that most detainees it observed at Abu Ghraib were civilians with no clear connection to armed groups. That context matters. The prison was not simply holding battlefield captives. It held large numbers of people whose legal status, evidence, and treatment were often uncertain. The early occupation of Iraq created a chaotic detention system. U.S. forces were fighting a growing insurgency, intelligence officers were desperate for information, and detention facilities were overcrowded and understaffed. Guards at Abu Ghraib were often poorly prepared for the mission they were assigned. At the same time, military police, military intelligence, and other agencies operated in overlapping roles, creating confusion about who was responsible for detainees and what rules applied. In that environment, abusive practices could be normalized, ignored, or rationalized as part of intelligence gathering. None of this excuses what happened. But it helps explain how a prison system under wartime pressure became a place where legal limits and moral boundaries were repeatedly crossed. The abuse at Abu Ghraib included physical assault, forced humiliation, threats, psychological torment, and degrading sexualized treatment. Detainees were photographed in positions meant to shame and dehumanize them. Some were forced to remain naked, placed in stress positions, threatened with dogs, or made to fear electrocution. The public photographs were only part of the record. Investigations and human rights reports described broader patterns of mistreatment, including severe physical and psychological abuse. One of the most serious cases was the death of Manadel al-Jamadi, a detainee who died during interrogation in 2003. His body was later photographed, and the handling of his remains became another sign that the prison had become a place where human life and dignity were dangerously devalued. The scandal reached the public because evidence from inside the prison did not stay hidden. In January 2004, a U.S. soldier reported abuse after seeing disturbing photographs. That triggered internal military investigations, including the Taguba report, which documented serious misconduct by military personnel. Then, in April 2004, CBS News broadcast some of the images on its program 60 Minutes too. Soon after, additional photographs appeared in the press. The effect was immediate and global. The images were replayed across television, newspapers, and the internet. They provoked outrage in the United States, anger across the Middle East, and condemnation from allies and human rights groups. In a war already facing growing skepticism, Abu Ghraib became a devastating blow to U.S. credibility. The Bush administration argued that the abuses were the actions of a small number of low-ranking soldiers, not official U.S. policy. Officials described the events as isolated incidents and emphasized that the people responsible would be punished. But humanitarian organizations challenged that explanation. The Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch pointed to similar allegations of harsh treatment in other U.S.-run detention settings, including Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay. Their argument was not that every facility was the same, but that Abu Ghraib fit into a wider post-9/11 detention system where the line between interrogation and abuse had been dangerously blurred. This disagreement became central to the scandal. Was Abu Ghraib a breakdown of discipline, or a symptom of policy choices made higher up? A major part of that debate involved documents later known as the torture memos. Written by lawyers in the U.S. Department of Justice before and after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, these memos gave narrow definitions of torture and argued that certain harsh interrogation methods could be legally permitted. They also claimed, in some contexts, that international humanitarian protections such as the Geneva Conventions did not apply in the usual way to foreign detainees held by the United States. Critics argued that these legal opinions helped create a permissive atmosphere, where officials and interrogators believed extreme methods could be authorized. Even if the memos did not directly order the abuses photographed at Abu Ghraib, they became part of the larger question of how law was interpreted during the War on Terror. The Geneva Conventions are central because they establish basic rules for the humane treatment of prisoners and detainees during armed conflict. They do not depend on whether a prisoner is popular, cooperative, or easy to classify. They exist precisely because war creates temptations to treat captured people as tools, enemies, or sources of information rather than human beings. The Bush administration's early legal positions were later challenged in court. In Hamdan v. Rumsfeld in 2006, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions applied to the conflict with al-Qaeda, requiring minimum standards of humane treatment. That ruling did not erase what happened at Abu Ghraib, but it did reject key assumptions behind the administration's detention policies. Military accountability focused mainly on soldiers directly involved in the abuse. The Department of Defense removed 17 soldiers and officers from duty. 11 soldiers were charged with crimes such as dereliction of duty, maltreatment, aggravated assault, and battery. Between 2004 and 2006, several were court-martialed, convicted, sentenced to military prison, and dishonorably discharged. Specialist Charles Graner, identified as a central figure in many of the photographed abuses, was convicted of assault, battery, conspiracy, maltreatment, indecent acts, and dereliction of duty. He received a 10-year sentence and lost rank, pay, and benefits. Private First Class Lynndie England was convicted of conspiracy, maltreatment, and committing an indecent act, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The punishments did not end the controversy, because many observers believed accountability stopped too low in the chain of command. Brigadier General Janusz Karpinski, who commanded detention facilities in Iraq, was reprimanded and demoted to colonel. But higher-ranking officials and policymakers who shaped detention and interrogation rules were not criminally prosecuted for Abu Ghraib. Critics argued that low-ranking soldiers became the public face of a broader system, while senior leaders avoided meaningful consequences. Supporters of the official response argued that prosecutors needed evidence tying specific individuals to specific crimes. This tension remains one of the scandal's lasting legacies. In complex military systems, proving direct responsibility can be difficult, but moral and command responsibility may extend far beyond the people in the photographs. Abu Ghraib also carried consequences beyond the courtroom. For Iraqis, the photographs deepened anger at the occupation and reinforced fears that U.S. forces did not respect Iraqi lives. For Americans, the scandal forced a painful confrontation with the gap between national ideals and wartime conduct. For U.S. troops, it complicated efforts to win trust from the population and gave insurgent groups a powerful propaganda tool. Internationally, Abu Ghraib weakened U.S. claims to moral leadership and intensified scrutiny of detention sites in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Guantanamo Bay. President George W. Bush and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld both apologized in 2004, but apologies could not undo the damage. The images had already become part of the historical record of the war. The Abu Ghraib scandal remains important because it raises questions that every democracy at war must answer. What rules apply when a government claims it faces extraordinary threats? Who is responsible when official language, legal memos, military pressure, and weak oversight combine to produce abuse. And how can a state investigate itself when the wrongdoing implicates not just individuals, but institutions? Abu Ghraib was not only a story of criminal acts inside a prison. It was a warning about what happens when fear overrides law, when detainees are treated as less than human, and when accountability is narrowed to the easiest people to punish. Its legacy is a reminder that human rights protections matter most when governments are under the greatest pressure to ignore them. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.